I'm Megan Cole with the Travel and Tourism Research Association, or TTRA, and we're so pleased to have CA, Vice President of AI, and Adriana, Vice President of Data Science from Miles Partnership, joining us today as they discuss unlocking tourism data with AI. We hope you all enjoy today's webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and our wonderful presenters will answer at the end of their session. We are so excited to learn from you all.
Great. Thank you very much. All right. We have, let's see if I can get my slides to advance here. We have a lot of stuff to get through today. So I'm going to go to our agenda slide here. There we go. So these are all things we want to try to cover today. We do have, we'll do some current state kind of stats, looking at what is going on. There's a little section in here where I will talk about things that AI is doing right now. And then we have some really valuable sections on how to think about using AI and then some use cases. And then we're going to finish up with some examples of things that that you could be using in your own role, in your own organization. So, as mentioned, I am CA Clark. I currently lead the AI initiatives at Miles, and I am joined by Andrea Godfrey, who I will let you introduce yourself, Andrea.
Oh, thank you, CA. I'm Andrea Godfrey, and I head up our data science and data partnership initiatives here at Miles Partnership.
Awesome. Thank you. One of the things that we do at Miles is a program called AI Opener for Destinations, which is a sort of global collaboration that explores the intersection of AI and travel. So every month we have a question that we explore. We've been doing that for all of 24 and all of 25. And some of the things that we're going to talk about today will have been explored or sort of sourced from AI Opener for Destinations. If it's something that you were interested in, we are making changes for the 2026 program, and we'll be announcing that on LinkedIn. So you can follow Miles on LinkedIn for announcements on AI Opener 2026, which will have some major changes to the way that we are doing that program. All right, moving into our first section here is current state. Try my clicker again. Sorry about that, folks. So the current state here, I'm just going to go through a number of different slides. We'll see if we can get my slide advance. There we go. Um, so first of all, looking at the sort of landscape of what is happening, you got about 50% of the users are using ChatGPT. You have about 20% with Gemini and 16% with Anthropic, and then you can see where the rest of them basically fall. Both Anthropic and Claude, so this data is probably 3 or 4 months old. Both Anthropic and Claude have gained ground in the last couple of months, particularly because of Gemini's release of their image model, which they called Nano Banana, and that drove a lot of interest in Gemini. So the landscape, even though is largely dominated by ChatGPT, is still very much changing, and there's there is no really clear winner at this point in terms of who is going to end up on top, or whether that will be multiple players, which is certainly very likely. Um, yeah, my clicker's not working, so you're gonna have to do that. Andy, I don't know what's going on there. I just want to do a couple of different stats here. This one is from Focusrite's data that is earlier in the year. The consumers increasingly expect AI to be part of their travel planning process. So over half of them, just over half of them, have used AI as part of their travel planning process, and 37% of them said that they expected travel sites to offer Gen AI tools for planning. Next slide. This one was in partnership with Focusrite. This one is from earlier in 2025, and in this one, there were a whole series of questions that were asked, and it was split up by different things. But the interesting one is that leisure travel was the number one expected use for AI in the next 12 months. They asked a whole bunch of different questions. What are you going to use it for? And leisure travel was the number one answer to that, which I think is really interesting, right? We think about all of the other uses that you could be using it for. And in this particular study, the leisure travel, using it to plan leisure travel, was a really important one. This one is much more recent. This is a study from Booking.com. They had a global AI sentiment report that came out just a couple of months ago, and there's some really interesting stuff in there about how people use things. The important part, though, is that in this study, 62% of people have used AI to book a trip, and 61% have used AI on a trip. So you're starting to see, like, the later in the year we get, the higher that kind of percentage gets in terms of the usage and the expectations. And then if we look at organizations, so this is from a study that was from May of 2025 on the state of marketing AI. This is largely marketing services, right? Professional services, software businesses, stuff like that. I would have to say that the people who answered this survey are most likely kind of at the front edge of AI adoption. In this particular case, only 14% of them are achieving wide scale adoption. So most of them are still in the piloting phase, the scaling phase, right? Just sort of trying to figure out what is going on. I think it's helpful to know this because it's really easy to feel like you're falling behind. And I hear that a lot from organizations when I talk to them. It's like, oh, we really need to get on top of this, which is true. But for the most part, organizations everyone is still struggling with this. Likewise, then looking at some other data that is available, this is a really fun one, the Anthropic Economic Index. And they publish this, I think, 4 times a year. Some really interesting stuff in here that you can explore. This one I actually just looked by research, and so these are research jobs that it has in there, and it tells you how other people in that space are using AI and what they're using it for. And then there's some just really fun stats in here. So the first one is country, and I put New Zealand in here because New Zealand is number 4, and I happen to be in New Zealand right now. So the beating the United States there, not on a lot of things, but certainly in this particular case. But you can look at it by country, and then you can see there's these, kind of get a sense of like how people are using it in the country, what they're using it for, what those percentages are, and you can see the highest percentage there is about 5%. So there's a lot of really diverse usage when you look at it by a country perspective, and then you can do that by state. So at the state level, you can see where the different states are. Washington, D.C. index is the highest there. Then interestingly, Utah, California, New York, you can see where the rest of them go down there. But really interesting, and you can do that same thing where you can dive into a particular state and look at like how are they using, what are they using in that state, what kind of activities are they doing? And then on this one, this sort of pulls out like different use cases, right? And I thought it was interesting that data analysis, manipulation, report and research creation are among the top uses, right? Like these are the top uses of use cases, and 4 of them were kind of related to either data or research, um, which is a really interesting number. Okay, and then this one is from a study by OpenAI that was a couple months ago, and in this one, they pitted AIs against humans. So they had a whole series of tasks in different categories, different job categories, and they had an AI agent do that task, and then they had a human do that task. And then the results of that were evaluated by a panel, sort of a blind taste test, if you will. And the panel then had to decide which one of those 2 outputs they preferred. And if they preferred the AI one, right, then that was a score for the AI, and then if they preferred the human one, that was a score for the human. So if you can see that dotted line that is in there, that is the midway point. So anything that is over that line, the AI results were preferred to the human results. And you can see the humans won, okay? Like, if you look across that, the humans won, and there were only a couple of cases where the AIs were over that line. But you can see that in a lot of cases, they were really quite close. If we go to the next slide, you can zero in on some of the ones that were quite close. Software developers, probably not a huge surprise. Shipping, receiving, inventory clerks, maybe a little bit of a surprise. Supervisors, medical health was kind of an interesting one. Nurse practitioners, you can see are really close to that line, and even lawyers. You can see some of those models really kind of creeping up on that line where human behavior is. So a lot of really interesting things that are happening in the AI space. So let's talk a little bit about what kinds of things we can do with AI, and we'll just go through these real quickly because some of these should be pretty familiar at this point. So obviously, we can use it to write things. We can use it to analyze things, right? So we can upload data, we can get charts, and I'll show you some of those examples once we get later on in the presentations. There's a lot of things in there. We can use it to research. We'll talk about some examples of that, but doing desktop research, right? And going out trying to find things is one of the other things that AI is really good at. Um, This one, so I'll talk about sorry, you can go back to that one, Andy. This one's really interesting, and we can talk about this one later. This is actually completely synthetic user groups. So I added this one in here for this group. You have this sort of research where you can go out and do like desktop research and look at websites and see what kinds of information are coming back. But this is one where you can go in and create a synthetic user group, and you just type in what you want to do, and it invents a bunch of people, and then those people have a conversation. It produces a transcript. That one's called Ensita. So I'm not saying that that would be a, a statistically significant or a valid way of doing it, but it is really interesting to think about, like if you were going to pre-run a piece of research with users to see what that looked like. You can go to the next one. And then obviously code is one of the things that is really good at. This is also a case where, and I'll show you some of these examples once we get to the end, where it's not so much that AI solves a problem, but the AI writes an application or a program or a model that can solve the problem that we have. And we'll show you some of the examples in our use cases later on where that's exactly what we did. Also really good at learning. So this is Notebook LM, and I'll talk about Notebook LM. Definitely one of the things that I think is really good, taking information, particularly reports, research, things like that, putting it into Notebook LM, and then being able to ask questions about that. One of the best tools, if not kind of the best tool in AI in 2024. And then also has some really fun little things. If you haven't played around with Notebook LM, you can create a podcast out of your information, which is quite cool. And now you can also create an entire video presentation. It will pull stuff out of your report, it will create its own presentation, and it will present it for you. So pretty interesting things that are happening with Notebook LM. Images, of course, probably less relevant to this audience, but tons of stuff happening in images. Things that used to take hours and hours for someone to do now take seconds. So in this next example, this is a classic one for travel and tourism. We have this ballroom, right? Like we have an event space of some kind, and we're trying to pitch that to an event planner. And normally, if we wanted to do those setups, we'd have to go, hire people and photographers and do all these setups and do everything else. At this point, we can just say add a bunch of tables with purple centerpieces, and then a couple minutes later, presto, you've got that same room with a bunch of tables and centerpieces. And granted, if you look at the silverware and some of the other things in there, it's not going to necessarily make sense. But from the perspective of trying to convince an event planner, this is a pretty easy way to do that. And then you can do other things, right? You can iterate on it, and you can say, oh, let's make it look like an evening view instead, to really give them a perspective of what that is. Which again, if you think about that 2-3 years ago, you would have had to do all of those photo shoots separately. Other stuff. So the video, right? Photo to video is advancing. This is a picture of, rather a video of my great grandparents, which I found at my parents' house. I've never met these people. They died long before I was born. But took an old photograph and then turns it into this crazy video where they move. Pretty interesting stuff. Same with other things. This is my trip to Alaska a couple of weeks ago, and I saw Bigfoot while I was out there, which was pretty cool. But really easy to just take a photo and put the photo in. And you'll notice in my glasses there, right? The fidelity of this video is quite high. This is from a single still photo. And you'll notice there's a person in my glasses. And when I turn away to look at Bigfoot and turn back, that person is still there. So that sort of world model fidelity is getting really, really high for video, which is both fascinating and also terrifying at the same time. And then in this next one, this is translation. So I took a video of me and then I uploaded that, and then it's actually remapped my mouth and my voice model in order to speak in a different language. So I'll just play a little clip of this for you.
Næsta spurning sem við fáum oft að það líður eins og þetta sé svindl. Ætti ég að nota þetta í daglegu starfi mínu? Og ég held að miða við samtölin sem við höfum átt við
I have no idea.
og eðlilegt að finnast þetta
That's Icelandic. We can go to the next slide there. But the fidelity is really, really high, right? Like it looks like I'm speaking. It sounds like I'm speaking in Icelandic. Some really interesting stuff that is going on there in AI video. And then just lastly, in the sort of capabilities part of this, we'll talk about agents. And so there's a lot of stuff that is happening in this space where agentic AI, basically an AI that can do more than talk. It can take some kind of an action. has access to either a browser or a full operating system and can do all kinds of things inside that operating system. And that is increasingly what we are seeing. This is definitely a space where this will dramatically change how people plan for travel, how they think about travel, and how they discover information about travel, sort of with that layer of separation between the decisions that they're making or the objectives that they have, and then the AI actually taking those actions, finding that information, and in some cases booking all the way through. So definitely one of the things that is dramatically changing how people plan and experience travel. Right. And at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Andrea, who has some great slides about how we think about using AI.
Perfect. All right. Let's see here. Give me 2 seconds to get my. There we go. Okay. So let's start with talking about just a simple use case of research. This is very basic research. So I asked 20 people if they owned pets. And then I went around and I asked people in the office, I said, take the following responses and put the information into an Excel spreadsheet and tell me 2 things you noticed about the information. So I asked the person's name, their pet type, the pet name, the breed, and then some persons were really eager and also gave some notes. So I did this analysis myself. So I'm a data person, I'm a numbers person. So for me, the first thing I looked at is first thing I did is I created a good old pivot table. Like I'm a classic over here. I enjoy a pivot table. So then within it, I automatically went to a numerical categorization of the animals. I wanted to look at the average pet owners, or pets by ownership. I wanted to look at the distribution, so the share of pet type. So these were my 2 things. And these are the 2 things that I observed. But I wanted to dig a little bit further and I wanted to guess and start to understand who and what kind of other answers I could be getting from persons on my team. And so I went to Claude and I went into Claude, who was glad that I was back here. And I asked it to tell me 2 things about the data set aside from what I had already done, which would be the count of average pets by owner and the distribution of pet type. So I uploaded my CSV and I had it start running the model for me. And so one thing that I really like about this with Claude is that I'm able to see the logic that it has behind the analysis that it's providing. And so I watched it think through things, bring up and point out the anteater, the unicorn, which also caught my attention, but weren't my 2 big things. And so pointed out information that was more qualitative versus quantitative. And so by going to Claude and by asking it to run an analysis, I got answers that were different and were unique from my own perspective. So, this is where, when we talk about AI and research, we start to look at interconnected benefits for the research process. And so, take for example, this very, very simple case of where I wanted to identify 2 unique things about pet ownership. What Claude was able to help me do was to augment my perspective and uncover connections in data. So things like there were 2 Davids, maybe something was wrong. We had fictitious animals. Also, I don't know if you saw there, it also called out that we seem to have some literary enthusiasts that are pet owners. So it augmented the view that I had. And it challenged my inherent bias and my assumptions. So for me, I am very biased to look numerically. Whereas by using AI in the research process, it can challenge our biases and the assumptions that we bring into data analysis. Bringing AI into research also assists us in that it's able to accelerate the pace of discovery. The analysis that Claude was able to do in that very basic example took potentially 30 seconds, I believe is what the video was, for me to run my own pivot table, come up with a very focused, kind of, I will say, somewhat biased perspective or a singular view. That took me several minutes, probably 5 or 10 minutes itself. So it accelerates the pace of discovery because it accelerates our ability to move through the research process. And it generates insights that neither AI or a human could have done alone. So when we talk about the use of AI in research, it's about the goal to augment, not to replace the steps in the research process. And this subsequently augments the depth and quality of insights. So I really like this quote here is that AI is not going to replace humans, but humans with AI are going to replace humans without AI. It's always this human and AI interconnected component that when we talk about the benefits of AI and we look at the use cases of where it's been done and implemented successfully, that has this dual approach. So there are really three buckets when we think about purposeful use of generative AI in the research process. So the first of which is a content and a literature review. So where AI is able to help us is with number one, semantic search. So it aids us in being able to identify new sources of both academic and industry information that we may have not been privy to or knowledgeable about whenever we began a content or literature review process. It also helps us to drive deeper understanding of previous work that's been conducted, looking at industry trends or phenomenons. And then, of course, whenever we talk specifically about academic literature reviews, it's important that we identify the gaps in previous research that has been done to be able to really centralize and validate the need for the research that we're doing. And so AI can very much assist in gap identification. So it allows us to be able to comb through large amounts of information in a more efficient way to be able to identify patterns and then also where those gaps are so that we're able to either from a content perspective identify trends and patterns, but from especially from a traditional literature review perspective, we're able to ensure that the gaps in theory and in research actually are there. It's not a question of us not identifying them ourselves. Also, when we talk about the other two buckets, it's more about data analysis. So, AI and implementing that in the research process really assists us in identifying patterns and being able to do this in high dimension data, and then also being able to do this across multimodal data sources. So, essentially, synthesizing large data sets that are not necessarily in the same format or have the same structure, AI allows us to bring those together. AI is also a very important tool to help validate our data analysis. So, this is where it can work in terms of providing bias detection, reproducibility verification. So, ensuring that there's validity and reliability in the analysis that we're doing. And then really check those statistical assumptions. So, providing alternatives to where anomalies are found in the data. So, whenever we talk about the purposeful use of AI, do make sure that you verify and cross reference your results. Maintain transparency about where AI is used and think of ways to augment your perspective on data analysis or scopes of insights collected. Don't simply copy AI generated content into your materials, especially whenever we're talking about working with sensitive or PII. Don't input this data without permission from those which the data is gathered or without doing true due diligence by understanding the data rights management of the platforms that you're using. And more importantly, or is as important, don't miss the opportunity to grow the field of knowledge around AI use in tourism research. The work that we do is very timely as we work at destinations. The work that we do in academia is a very new field compared to what we have of other sciences, like traditional chemistry or archaeology or anthropology. So, growing a field of knowledge, especially around this new technology, is so important as we grow the efficacy of the work that we do in the industry that we're in. So, in terms of best practices, make sure that you have goal solution alignment. Identify the goals for the project. So, don't start with simply you want to use AI. Start with what your goals are and plan out the steps that you need to get there and identify those steps which AI can augment the process in terms of efficiency, depth of knowledge collection, in terms of ensuring reliability and validity. And create content explaining AI in use and how AI is used within the work that you're doing. So, why was it used? What was it used for? Has the research process been improved or augmented, and how so? And what is the benefit that it provides to the organization or the academic association that you're working with? So let's look at two use cases of where AI has been used in practice for destinations. So, the first of which is we had a destination that asked a simple question: does a relationship exist? The challenge was looking at how lodging demand related to the generation of sales tax. For this destination, it was very unique in the fact that the destination was funded by hotel lodging tax, but it was responsible for also generating that sales tax. So it had a dual role. So we needed to gather information. So we gathered category level tax detail and monthly sales tax collections. And we wanted to make sure that we had this for a full year so that we were understanding seasonality. So we wanted to do a simple just share by month analysis to give us directional insights. And then we wanted to run a true R coefficient for monthly correlations between sales tax categories and room demand. So when we started looking at the sales tax data and we started looking at the lodging demand, we realized that what we needed to do was actually clean up the data set a little bit here. And we wanted to back out any of that lodging tax that was sitting in the sales tax category. So essentially what we wanted to be left was sales tax less the lodging component. So we removed that so that we weren't getting any skews caused by rate fluctuations with seasonality. So we used Claude because we wanted to run a statistical model which we could go back and backtrack and validate our analysis with it. And we found there was an extremely strong positive correlation between the monthly share of non-lodging tax and the monthly share of room nights sold. So in fact, this was actually almost a perfect linear relationship when we looked at it basically on share, and then also whenever we looked at it on a volume and a dollars based perspective. But there still was a little bit of noise that we were seeing in the data. So this is where Claude and I got in a bit of an argument. So this is where it's important to go back to AI and question it. So we started looking at the R correlation and we said that great, there's extremely strong correlation. But we noticed that there were a couple months where the correlation got weaker. And then when we look at July, it was actually negative. And so we said that doesn't make any sense because when we look at the volume and we look at the spend, it's high. So what we ended up coming up with was looking at how we wanted to communicate the R coefficient. And we found that it wasn't really a way to communicate value. By the way, I was wrong and Claude was right. It was negative, but it did prove it to me and it proved me wrong, which is a great way to validate my analysis. And so what we wanted to look at is we realized that the R coefficient was good to be able to say, let's check the box and say that we found that there is a correlation. But there wasn't really a measure of value. And that's where we needed to go beyond the statistical analysis. So that's where we went kind of back to old school, looking at just share. And what we ended up finding was that essentially when we looked at those months where the correlation was actually lower or negative compared to winter months, it was the summer months. And we were looking at the share of retail tax and the share of food and beverage tax. And so what we actually found is that these categories were what were creating a negative relationship with our statistical model, but they were in a good way because during those summer months, people were more likely to get out, eat, and shop and spend money. Where in the winter months, they were spending more time on the slopes, most likely, and they weren't opening up their wallets quite as much. So, the next question that we had was from another destination that said, how do we solve for a gap in measurement? So the challenge was that we had a change in visitor volume tracking partnership that left a destination with a 5-month gap in reporting. And what was our interim solution? So this is where we wanted to turn to a solution that was both multimodal, but also one that we were able to test and validate and communicate to partners. And so what we did is we actually used AI to pull, aggregate, clean, and format data from our available sources. So these sources were traditional lodging data. This was things like GA4. We used some additional media tracking information as well. We pulled that together and ran 5 statistical models, and we used Claude Code as where we came with this. And what we ended up deciding to do was to actually not rely on any of the individual models that we used using Claude and that we ran with. And we actually used a weighted ensemble methodology. So essentially, can I go back? Can we go one more forward? Thank you. And I will stop touching the mouse. So essentially what we ended up running with is we used a 5-month statistical prediction for this data gap. And we used an ensemble base where we essentially weighted the different models that we ran with a large language model, and we used those with an ensemble approach. So essentially, we weighted each of the methodologies, and we did this to create a singular output. Essentially, why we did this is because we wanted to make sure that there was strong interpretability across stakeholders, because it's very important to note that it's not just us that are sitting there looking at the data, it's their partners. We also wanted to make sure that we were using recency weighting and that we were using a very transparent model. So we didn't want to just have one single model that was sitting in a black box. So for example, when we think about this, while we did run and we did validate a random forest and an XG boost model, that probably would not resonate as strongly with stakeholders as if we could go back and speak to more of estimates and weighting that we were able to show the output in a graphical form. And so with that, we were able to come up with our analysis that solved for this 5-month gap. And we did this by pressure testing, cleaning, and bringing together these disparate data sets to create this model that the destination is going to be able to use to fill this gap. And we did so in a way where we used AI to validate the analysis, to really challenge the different analysis between the models and come up with an output that we could easily communicate and we could visually demonstrate to the stakeholders of the destination. So with that, I'll turn it back over to CA.
Excellent.
There we go. So in this section, we wanted to assemble some suggestions for you for different tools to use, different use cases that you might use those for. We have a couple of little examples in here. But before we go into those, I wanted to talk a little bit about the paid versus free. Everyone who is on this webinar should be using a paid version of one of these tools. So there's just not really a good reason, especially if you're using data, particularly if you are manipulating or analyzing data. It's really important that you're using one of the paid tools. You get better features, you get better privacy, better security, higher usage limits, and then access to reasoning in a bunch of different ways. So hopefully all of you already are, but the number of people that I talk to often are still using the free tier, and I think that's a really important distinction. Secondly, then I wanted to talk a little bit about how we approach these problems, right? How we think about them. So Andrea went through some really good steps of how to think about using AI in particular situations. This is a course that we recommend from Anthropic, which is free. It doesn't really have anything to do with Anthropic's tools. It's really applicable to anything. It's a framework of how you go about solving a problem. And the two things that I want to point out in here are the very first part of this. There's two steps at the very beginning of that. And the first one is problem awareness, which anyone should be able to do, right? You have to be able to articulate what your problem is before you can decide how you're going to solve that problem, which seems obvious, but it often gets missed, especially when we're working with AI. So that first part is awareness, being able to articulate and say what your problem is. And then the second most important part of that is understanding this really sort of deep and broad understanding of what the tools are capable of so that you can make a decision about which parts of those belong with the AI and which parts of those belong with the human. That platform awareness part really only comes through, broad usage of the platforms and sort of trying to push the edges of what things it can do. And so you heard Andrea earlier talked about going back and challenging the results to make sure that those things were in there. That's part of that sort of pushing the edges to build up that platform awareness, because you can't really reliably solve a problem without these two pieces. Also mentioned in there was the sort of validation or the verification step of that, and that is really critical. Organizations and individuals, we don't have the discipline really to do this sort of verification. But it is really, really important when we're talking about AI, using AI for anything at all. So the best place to use it is where where the output is easily verified. And so I'll give you three different examples of those, right? The first and the easiest one is that you know it, right? So the best place to use it is something that you already know. And I use an example. My wife is a physician and she can use ChatGPT to do, ask a question or get a differential diagnosis. I cannot, because I can ask that question. I can say these are the symptoms, but the answer that I get, I have no idea what any of those things mean. She can look at them and say that one doesn't matter. This one isn't related. That's a good idea. I hadn't thought of that. And that's a really good example of using your own knowledge to verify. If you can't do that, then is it testable? Okay, is it a formula for something like an Excel formula or a JavaScript function or some other kind of thing, programming thing? You can test it. You can say it either does what it is supposed to do or it doesn't. And if it's not that sort of a thing, can you source it? Can you go find the information that is supposed to that it is referencing and validate that that is actually what that report says? Really important step. Anything that is the further you get away from any of those three things, the more careful you have to be with the output that you get out of the AI. Okay. So let's look at a couple of different examples of things. This sort of similar to that paid versus free. Everyone in this webinar should be using extended thinking or reasoning for pretty much anything that you're doing. If you are asking a really simple question, you're probably better off using Google for something like that. So I'm assuming that you're using AI for something that is more sophisticated than asking for some easy question. And in that sense, you should always be using a reasoning model. So if you use ChatGPT, you can go up to the top and you can do that little drop down and you can switch it from the default to thinking. And then in Claude, you can turn on extended thinking. And then in Gemini, you have to switch from using the Flash model to the Pro model in order to sort of activate that reasoning or that thinking. That alone will make a really big difference in the number of errors that you get out of the model is just by enabling that. So there's really not a scenario in a professional setting where you should be using a model that doesn't include reasoning. Next, we'll talk about Perplexity. So some of you are probably familiar with Perplexity. If you are not, they call themselves a research engine versus a search engine. They are using other people's models. They have their own proprietary model as well, but you can use ChatGPT inside Perplexity. It's basically a recipe for how to go look up information, where to look for that information, how to cite and source that information. So one of the things that Perplexity is really good at is doing this sort of desktop research kind of function where you are, go find me all of the research that exists on a particular topic and then pull all of that stuff back in. And the best part is when we were talking about validation is that Perplexity is really good about citing where it got those. So it makes it really easy then to go in and click on the link, go and review the research that it found on your own to make sure that it matches up with what the conclusion is. It doesn't particularly do anything, analysis-wise different than you would get with ChatGPT, but I do think it's much better at collecting and organizing information, and feels like it's a little bit more thorough when it comes to that. Next, we'll talk about custom GPTs. This is also the same thing, the same functionality that we were talking about in ChatGPT is called a custom GPT. In Gemini, it is called a gem, and in Claude, it is called a project. They all do exactly the same thing. They're specialized chats that you can build with your own directions and your own knowledge, and upload resources into that custom GPT. It's basically like preloading a chat that says, "This is the topic. These are the results that I want." And you can get really, really complicated with custom GPTs. You can build these really long kind of instructional sets that say only do things in this way, only answer in this way, always answer in this sort of format. If you have anything at all, this is like bread and butter functionality for any organization, right? Using custom GPTs. If you have anything that you do more than once, that is a candidate for custom GPTs, right? Any task, whether it's per client, per day, per quarter, per whatever, that's where you want to think like, is there a way that I could do this? Especially when it's a discrete task. There's lots of controls that you can put in there. So one of the controls that you'll see flash on the screen there is the ability to turn off search. And so in a custom GPT, I could upload a bunch of my own documents, and I could prevent ChatGPT from going out to the web and then trying to acquire other documents so that it is anchored in the documents that I gave it. Custom GPTs, if you are not using them, definitely you should be exploring that. That is one of the best ways to use AI to narrow in on tasks and doing things in a repeatable way. Next then is data visualization. And so the current models have gotten really, really good at data visualization. So these are just some dummy examples where Claude plots visitor and revenue trends over time, can put together. They're interactive if you want those, but they don't have to be interactive. You can do them, as images. You can export them as screenshots, stuff like that. But really complex visualizations that used to be very hard to do, right? Would take hours and hours, or took someone with very specialized knowledge to figure out exactly what to do there. You can take that data, you can put it into any of these models and ask for those visualizations and get really remarkably good results out of that. Next then is deep research. So this actually sort of similar to Perplexity. So all of the tools, ChatGPT, Gemini, and Claude have a research function, a deep research function. Those are again are essentially recipes that say do these things in this order. First go make a plan, and that's basically what happens in all of these cases. The recipe says the figure out what the user wants, make a plan for how you're going to find that information, go and collect that information, and then synthesize that information into a report. It can be really, really good, especially if you are looking for particular kinds of information or sources for things, right? I'm looking for all of the research from 2025 that mentions, um, you know, visitors to Kalamazoo, Michigan, right? Whatever that is. And you can send deep research on that process to go and look for that information. The trade-off is that's a process that might have taken you 2 weeks to do, and at the end of those 2 weeks, you would be in a position to make a presentation about that data, right? You would have a very high level of familiarity with that data, and you could do things with it at the end of those 2 weeks because you were the one that performed and found all of that information. Deep research doesn't replace that 2 weeks, right? It can turn one part of that into a 20-minute process, but it still takes time for you to go through, validate the information that it has returned, validate that the information that the conclusions that it drew were aligned with the data that was supplied, and then if nothing else, for you to really understand what was collected and what it means. So it can take a 2-week process and turn it into maybe a 1-week process or a 3-day process, but it doesn't take a 2-week process and turn it into 20 minutes because your role in it is very different than it would be if you were doing it or if you had someone on your team doing that research, day by day and finding that. Personally, the each of them does things slightly differently. So for whatever it's worth, if I'm doing a research process, I actually run it in all 3 or in some cases 4 of these. So Perplexity has like another level where you can go in and do, research at kind of a more rigorous level. Um, Frankly, anytime I'm doing that research, I run it in all 4 of those and then sort of collect the information and see what sort of commonalities I have in there. But obviously, that requires paid accounts on a number of different places. For the most part, I would say that they are interchangeable. So whatever paid one you have, deep research is a great way to collect information. Here's an example of that. This was a case where one of our subsidiaries was doing a report, and they were putting together this report for a client that was about stewardship plans, all of which are public, and they wanted to compare like the different features of stewardship plans across all of these different destinations. So all of that stuff is available online, all of that stuff, but it's complicated to find it. And then looking through there and trying to find the different headings, right? What does this one say about this? What does this one say about this? Is really time consuming. So you basically took 40 hours of desktop research and put that down to something more like 8 hours of validation, where all of that information had already been collected, it had already been assembled into an Excel document. And then someone could spend 8 hours going through and just making sure that those were actually where they were. There's a link, you click on a link, you go to the one for Copenhagen, and you go, oh, yep, sure enough, that is what it says in Copenhagen. And instead of having to do that one by one manually, you can do that all in one shot. So a great example of using deep research, not necessarily to replace a process, but to certainly cut down on the amount of time that it takes to do that process. Notebook LM, I mentioned earlier. If you ask me, this is one of the best least used products. And one of the best things that came out of 2024 was Notebook LM. The main thing, if you're not familiar with Notebook LM, the main thing about Notebook LM is that it is 100% grounded in whatever you give it. So you can give it a set of sources, and increasingly you can use different kinds of sources, different file formats, different ways of uploading that information. It's PDFs, it's Excel documents, Word documents, all kinds of stuff. And you can put that in as sources, and then Notebook LM only answers from those sources. And that's really the most important distinction, is that it's much less prone to hallucinations because it is not pulling information from somewhere else. It is not trying to make up an answer. If it can't find an answer, it just doesn't have an answer. So it was designed for education. It was designed for learning. You were supposed to put in your chemistry, worksheet or workbook, and then you were supposed to ask questions and it would help you understand your chemistry. But it turns out it's really good at doing all kinds of things, especially when we have data that we need to analyze or that we need to ask questions of. It also is really good at citing and sourcing, and so in the answer that it gives you, it will have little clickable things, and it will take you directly to the document that says, "This is where I got that in the document," which makes it really fast when you are trying to validate information on the other side of that. So here's a really good example of that. This was a study that was being done, where we had sort of similar to the earlier one, where we had tons of these action plans and strategic plans, hundreds of them that we had in a folder that we were trying to find commonalities for, right? We were trying to look at how many of them have this, right? What is the percentage of them that focus on this? How long are they, right? All of these other questions. And we took hundreds of those and put them into Notebook LM, and then compared, well, I guess in this case was 34, so maybe not hundreds. But then compared across them and said, we need to find these particular things, and then we need to format the answers in a particular way to talk about whether or not they're specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. And so all of that, right? All the sources that are in there, Notebook LM is really is easy to pull that out, and then puts all of that. We can paste that into an Excel document that just sort of highlights all of those answers directly and are verifiable. You can see there where it has those little numbers. You can click on those numbers, and it will take you directly to the source of that to validate whether or not that is the correct number. So great example. If if you're not using Notebook LM, that is a great source, or a great tool rather. And then coding, which we already heard from Andrea on, is a great example. And I think a lot of people think about using AI in a way where you take you take your input and you have an idea what your output is, right? What you want to report. I have these things and I want to report. And you put them into the AI, and then you say, like, make this report. And that sometimes that works, okay? But more often than that, it is a much more complex set of steps that you have to go through. And one of the things that AI is really good at is creating code to analyze data rather than analyzing the data on its own. So there's a sort of a profound difference between saying, analyze this data and tell me the answer, which in some cases will work, and saying, create a program that can analyze this data to give me the answer, is sort of a step down from there, but is still using AI to do that, and can be incredibly powerful, as you saw in the example that Andrea had earlier. So basically, if you know anything at all about coding, right, if you can write it or even really read HTML, JavaScript, Python, PHP, any programming language, um, then you now have a superpower, right? Because you can sort of identify, like, oh, I can see how that would work or not work, and you can have the model make all kinds of code for you, and turns out to be really, really quite sophisticated in its capabilities. Okay, and then I will give you, so those are kind of the core functions that we think are important, and suggested for you. If any of those are ones that you haven't tried out, we definitely suggest that you try them. And then I'll give you a couple of other little examples of things that you may or may not have heard of. One of them is a tool called Napkin. A napkin is an AI model that is designed to take sketches or outlines and turn them into diagrams. They're not exactly visualizations, but they can do relationships really well. And so you can take an example and give it to Napkin, and then it will give you hundreds of different options of how you can do that in a diagram. So that's a really good one, and is quite focused on what it does. And then there's a number of automation or agentic platforms. So make.com, agent.ai, even more traditional ones like older ones like N8 or Zapier all have AI capabilities, and you can create no code automations. And part of the reason that this is really handy is that often there are things where you would have to run it manually with ChatGPT, let's say, 50 or 100 times. So you can get the result that you want, but having to run it manually over and over again isn't a very effective use of time. And going to an automation platform like this will give you the ability to just sort of say, run this same thing 60 times and then pipe the output into something else. So that can be a really powerful change as well. And then you have this happening all over the place. There's lots of these no code platforms. They seemingly a new one every day. Google has an experiment that they call Opal, which is all AI apps. You don't even have to do API connections. You basically just connect the thing inside of Google and it solves all of that. OpenAI announced an agent kit that more or less does the same thing. And then there's, hundreds of those popping up all over the place. And then lastly, I mentioned earlier one called Ensita that was about user testing. And so this one is a really interesting one. This is a company called Synthetic Users, and they offer this kind of pre-run, right? So they have really sophisticated profiles of individuals and they can create them exactly the sort of thing that you want. And then you can ask questions and you can get sort of results from those synthetic users. They're careful to say that it is not a replacement for talking to humans, but it is a relatively more cost-effective way of doing pre-run for what would be really expensive research. So they have a number of companies that use this where instead of doing one user study, they'll do 4 or 5 with the synthetic grape before they make decisions about those questions, and they actually go out and spend that with with actual users. So really fascinating. That one is a fun one if you want to look that one up. Some interesting stuff in there. And that brings us to the end of our session, and we do have a couple of minutes for questions. I think there might have been one in the chat, but if you have any questions, please put that into the Q&A now.
I'm happy to read it out loud if that'd be helpful. Seeing?
That would be great. Thank you.
All right. So, in using AI for analyzing research, what is the best way to maintain the confidentiality or priority information when uploading data into the platforms?
I can start with that answer. So the short answer to this is you have a paid platform. Um, so the real question that you have to ask is whether or not the material that you upload, that you input, is being used for training. That is the core question that you need an answer to whenever you are using any kind of tool at all. The paid versions of those tools, either by default, almost universally by default, will not have that enabled. But it's still something that you have to check. The free versions will almost always have that enabled by default, and in some cases, you can't even turn that option off where it is being used for training material. And just to be clear, when you are uploading something, some proprietary information into, let's say, ChatGPT, just as an example, if it is being used for training material, it is training material for the next version of the model, right? Not today's model, because that information is frozen. It is for the next version of the model. So just yesterday, ChatGPT 5.1 came out, right? Which would be an update from 5 to 5.1. And so that would be technically a new model and then could have ingested things that people uploaded into the free version of ChatGPT. On a paid account, I don't see that there is a material difference between uploading that information to something like Google Drive or SharePoint and uploading it into ChatGPT. There are nuances to that, right? But fundamentally, I don't think if it's something that you are comfortable putting in a cloud storage, I think that it is roughly the same thing to do that with ChatGPT as long as it's on a paid account.
Yeah. No, I'm aligned with you on that. It's like if you want to take extra steps with it, you can anonymize any identifiable information. So instead of if you have a record that is, it's an Excel doc and it has Andrea Godfrey and then my responses, you can pull out Andrea Godfrey and anonymize it with a 352 and use that to process your data. Also, if you're if you are testing a model that you are looking to use or one that you're building, you can use sample data or synthetic data to do the training. If you don't need to use you know, uh, actual data, don't necessarily do that. And then also you can segment it. So simply by segmenting out your data sets, so instead of uploading an entire data set, break it out into multiples that it's then pulling from, if that makes sense in the structure of the data that you're using. That's also something that you could do as well.
Wonderful. We have a few more questions, so I will pose them. So, prompts are what how you ask is very important. What is your recommendations about how to write prompts?
My first recommendation on writing prompts. So I have two. My first one is and that Anthropic Fluency course is really good at highlighting the sort of pre-steps for that. So a lot of my kind of hesitation about prompt libraries or suggesting prompts is that it missed the why, right? It jumps right to the how and it misses the like, why am I doing, what are you trying to accomplish and how are you doing that? So my first recommendation is that you got to back up to this level of what problem am I trying to solve? How do I break that problem into different steps? Which parts of those steps are is an AI going to be good at it? And which model is that? And then you can get into the sort of prompt construction. And there are tons of different prompt constructions, crit and ape and casino and like all these different acronyms that you can use to figure out how to structure a prompt. If you're happy with those, you can certainly use those. It helps you to think through what those steps are. You can also ask, ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini or whatever to help you write a prompt. And they actually turn out to be really good at writing prompts. So you can basically say, these are the things that I'm trying to accomplish. This is why this matters to me. This is the information that I'm looking for. How would I write a prompt to do that? And it will give you the prompt, and then you can copy paste that and put that in, or move to a different model and use it in a different model.
Wonderful. We have a question. I'm sorry, Andriana, if I'm cutting you off. We've got two more I want to try to get in. How can we ensure AI finds our destination information? Should we do repeated searches of our destination on various platforms?
Really good question. Part of the problem, yes and no. So yes, I think you should because I think you need to know. I think you need to have a that platform awareness, right? How do AIs answer questions? How do people use them? What kinds of answers are being given? I definitely think you need to have that sort of fluency and familiarity with it. But they are purposely non-deterministic, which means you have to be really careful drawing any conclusions, right? If you run 10 ChatGPT searches for your destination and it answers in some particular way, there's absolutely no guarantee that it's going to answer that way for me or someone else. And so you can't jump to conclusions from that and say, oh, obviously, if I do this, then it will show up in those models. The answers are just wildly different. So yes, I think you should understand that. But I think you have to be careful about drawing those conclusions. The best part you can get out of that is what is being cited, because those are opportunities, partnership or distribution opportunities. That's the most valuable thing you can get out of that.
Wonderful. And then we had two questions surrounding hallucinations in AI. So something along the lines are paid versions getting better at reducing hallucinations with regard to lit searches?
In the sense that you get access to more reasoning and thinking capabilities, the paid ones are much better. So that's the first answer to this. Is if you're not using a reasoning model or a thinking model, then you will find that there is a big reduction in kind of the errors that you get just by switching to that. Increasingly, the models have got, if you look at over time, the models have gotten better and better at reducing those kinds of hallucinations. There's a bunch of research that is out right now, papers that have been written about the reasons that that happens. And so I expect in the next 18 months that we will see further reductions on those errors. There's a debate about whether that will ever become zero or not, but certainly reductions are definitely possible, are happening already, and are headed in a direction that will mean they are rare in another 6 months or 18 months.
Great. All right, friends, we are right at time, so I'm going to wrap us up. Thank you so much, Andriana and CA, for sharing. And thank you for everyone for attending our call today. You'll receive links to access this webinar recording in the coming days. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks again, everyone. We hope you have a great day.